Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Joining me is senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all of our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. It wasn't until 1978 that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, after the priesthood temple ban on Black members was lifted, began sending missionaries to sub-Saharan Africa. Since then, though, the Utah-based faith has seen dramatic growth in the continent, and now Latter-day Saint temples and chapels can be found in a multitude of African nations. So what are the appeals of this American-born faith in lands so physically and culturally distant? How does the church balance its U.S. roots with its international outreach? Here to discuss this is Laurie Maffly-Kipp, the Richard L. Bushman Chair of Mormon Studies at the University of Virginia, who just delivered her first major speech at the school, which was called Mormonism Through an American Lens. Laurie, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Let's start with the question posed in the introduction. Why do you think so many Africans are joining this, quote, foreign church? What are some of its appeals?
I think that there are a lot of reasons people are joining the church. One important one is that it provides a lot of resources to people in a place that is resource poor, relatively speaking. So there are opportunities to network through church channels. There are educational opportunities. That's, I think, a huge draw. People start out by coming for the education and staying for other reasons. When I visited in Accra, Ghana several years ago, I noted that one of the few places to get consistent internet around the city was in the local institute buildings, the seminary settings where students could come. They'd work all day. Sometimes they'd just stay there and work on their homework. They were taking courses through the Pathways program through BYU Idaho and getting degrees that way. And they got to know, senior missionary couples who were teaching a lot of the courses, local courses on the ground. So they made these connections that allowed some of them then to move, to other countries and to sort of use those connections to, gain access to all kinds of things that they otherwise wouldn't have.
So those seem like some of the practical reasons. When I have reported from Africa, I met a lot of people who told me that the Joseph Smith story, the farm boy who talked to God, mystical experience, they could really relate to that because they had lots of mystical visionary experiences themselves. Do you think that's also the Joseph Smith story being a kind of a opening for some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a real tradition in a number of West African cultures of very enthusiastic spirituality and the belief in the existence of angels and devils and all this world of spirits that it is, it's not exactly the way the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints talks about it, but it's translatable, I think, for people to believe that a young boy could become a prophet. There are lots of Christian prophets in West Africa. And so that idea, in fact, is probably easier for them to incorporate into their understanding than for Americans these days.
So in your presentation, you said some Africans see Mormonism as, quote, the quiet church.
Right.
Well, what do they mean by that?
They meant, I think, that it was in a culture that was otherwise saturated with the noise of religion, the sounds of religion, the sights of religion. When I gave this talk, I showed pictures of just, things you see on the street, and you can't go a block on a street in Accra without seeing some sign for a local prophet or the Winners Chapel or some other church, demanding your attention. And on Sunday mornings, all you can hear blasting through loudspeakers are church services. So it's all around you. And I think, some people, it's a double-edged sword in a way, because for some people, going into an LDS church provides quiet from all of that. And some people really are drawn to the kind of peace and sense of order that they find there. Other people think, well, that must mean the Spirit's not there if you can't hear it and if you can't see it on the street. So it's not that it appeals to all people the same way, but I think for some people it has a very, very strong appeal.
So you open, Laurie, your presentation displaying this picture of Latter-day Saint women, I think it's Ghana, wearing these colorful traditional dresses, and woven into it are these big photos or pictures of American white Mormon prophets. And It's a fascinating photo. And you talk about how different people have different reactions to it. What does that say? What are the different things people see in that image? What does that say about them and the church?
That's a great question. I'm so arrested by this photograph generally. So I think for some people, they see that and they only see sort of the American imposition of power and this sort of post-colonial. Well, let's just, the big American group is going to come in and railroad their way into another country. So they see it as a singularly a bad thing. Other people, I think, look at it and see something quite different. They see, there are ways in which African textiles have extremely sort of important historical and spiritual significance in those cultures. So they see this almost as a way for people to sort of take their own agency and make what they will of this tradition and literally weave it into their own lives. So you can, I think, see rather divergent, ways of understanding it. Some people just think it's funny. To see Joseph Smith or to see Gordon B. Hinckley on this very traditional African dress.
And they're really big images of those men,
they
too.
Are big images.
So,
They are really big images. Yeah. But, when I gave this talk, someone at the talk came up to me afterwards and said, I know someone from Ghana and she has a Joseph Smith dress.
Wow.
So,
wow.
It's not just this picture. I think it's part of a larger sort of pattern.
Yeah. Deeper into your presentation, you talk about something that I found interesting. While many progressives, say U.S. Latter-day Saints, criticizes their church's patriarchy, some African women have a different view about what the church's teachings have done for them and their families. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, for some women, and I'm not by a long shot, not the first person to notice this. I mean, Sharon Eubank talked about it famously in a talk that she gave to the Fair Mormon conference in 2014. Talked about sort of the sense of order that the church can bring to family life in places where domestic violence is a real live concern. To have a setting where men are being taught not to beat their wives, as fundamental as that seems, and as maybe odd to those of us in other places, it's really important. And for women, providing them with educational opportunities that women often don't have. These settings gives them sort of all kinds of skills and ways of reordering their family life that are very important. I think the other piece of this that's important that I've heard from some women talk about is that in Relief Society, women teach each other skills that then allow them to get jobs. So that I read one account by a woman who was a caterer. And in Relief Society, she was teaching other women how to do catering so that they could start their own businesses. So it's sort of a jumping off point for small business establishment by women who do a lot of the work, admittedly, in those cultures.
And at the same time, the Relief Society women are doing that. How the men are in the priesthood meeting, I suppose, and being taught, like you say, to be loving to their wives and nurturing to their children and taking care of their family responsibilities, right?
Exactly. And to be brothers to one another, literally, which I think is an important piece, that there are lots of other forces in West African society sort of pulling young men out of helpful kinds of and supportive kinds of relationships. So there are gang issues that a lot of young men raise that say, I found my gang in the priesthood rather than on the streets.
So speaking of relationships between the sexes, what do you think? What do you think the impact has been of the church's word of wisdom? I have heard that once men give up alcohol, the word of wisdom forbids alcohol, coffee, and tea, but especially alcohol. Once men give up alcohol, they do tend to be kinder and gentler.
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. What do you think the impact has been of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I didn't hear people talk about that directly, so I don't have any firsthand anecdotes to share with you. I would just say that it makes sense that, of course, when you're not drinking a lot, you're not going to be beating your wife as much, and that there is the inhibitions that are dropped when people drink lead to all kinds of bad ends sometimes. So I think, that's part of the ordering process, right? The personal ordering, the familial ordering process that the church can provide for people.
You talk about an African woman who went to some church thing and said in a kind of like some amazement, kept repeating, "This is a women's church. This is a women's church." Now, why did she think that? What's the reasoning? Because, like I say, many people would think just the opposite, possibly.
Right. Well, no, she said this is Sharon Eubank's famous speech that she gave called "This is a Woman's Church," and in it she recounts the story of a friend of hers who went to Ghana and talked to this woman who kept saying, "This is a woman's church." And her point, I mean, she finally asked her, like she nodded, nodded to her, smiled for a while, and finally asked her, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And she said, "Because, in Relief Society, I'm allowed to sort of, have these learning opportunities. And my husbands are learning not to beat their wives," which, it boils down to a kind of what seems like wow, that's, I never thought of that as being something that happens in the priesthood meetings, but it makes perfect sense in that society, I think, where women, suffer at the hands of their husbands much more regularly, at least than in some other places. So
the church is changing its sacred undergarment, allowing open sleeves and half slips, even kind of full slips, to better accommodate men and women in hot, humid climates. How do you think this might affect members in Africa?
Well, it's certainly hot in West Africa. I can only imagine it being a very good thing that just allow for more breathability. The news has sort of changed quickly, and you can tell me, Peggy, if this is going to be a universal. I mean, is it going to be everywhere? Is it going to be only in hot climates? How do you decide which hot climates is going to be in? There are all kinds of questions that it raises for me.
Our research says it will be everywhere, but not soon, not for at least a year.
Yeah. It's in a beta testing phase, it sounds like right now, which makes sense. You sort of try things out. I think it sounds like a very practical thing to do, but one that would certainly be of benefit. Any woman that's been in a hot climate knows how much you don't want to have clothes clinging to you. I can't imagine that there is going to be.
Did you notice most women in the African countries you visited wore dresses primarily?
Yes. At least, I saw a lot of them in church related settings. They were wearing dresses. There were, I went to a Light the World celebration when I was there because it was in December, and there were a lot of people dressed in very fancy clothes. Some people had dresses that didn't have sleeves at all. That were without sleeves. But I didn't know if those were non-church members. I didn't want to go around asking people about their membership. So it's a little hard for me to know whether that's something that would be allowed in certain contexts. But almost all the women I saw, I think modesty actually is it's something I took to be sort of a cultural value at least in Ghana itself. It might be defined slightly differently from American modesty, but women were wearing long dresses. I think they would have done that anyway. I don't think it was just about church membership.
Africa in this rollout of these new garment styles, while they won't come to the U.S. till the end of 2025, they're saying, it shows that Africa was very much on the leadership's minds. They did the Philippines also, of course, some other hot places, but a lot of these rolled out in Africa first. That must seem that the top leaders are aware of what's happening in Africa, right?
Absolutely. I think they're very concerned about it. What interested me about the rollout was that the places in Africa where it was initially rolled out, and Peggy, you've been to Uganda, it's not the hottest country in Africa by a long shot. And so I was kind of puzzled. Like, I wonder how these choices were made and, who, on what basis, because it wasn't clear to me. But I think there is increasingly an effort to get more two-way communication between Utah and some of these more remote areas, but it's hard. It's hard to get that kind of feedback that you need.
As we said at the start, the church is growing fast and fastest in some places in parts of Africa, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and specifically growing faster or more in the global South overall. What does that portend for the faith's future and how leaders should shape their policies and messaging?
Well, that's a great question. It's growing. It's always been up until post 1978. It's been primarily a Western Hemisphere church, right? So it's grown in the South Pacific. It's grown in the Americas very quickly. So that's been going on now for 70 years. The African piece is, I think, a little different. I think actually, it's. What I'm discovering in my research overall is that it sort of how the church deals with local contexts really dependent on when it comes into that context, what the relationship, what the political situation is in that place, how people perceive Americans. Because there are very huge differences, I think, between some place like the Philippines, where there's been a long history of American involvement there and the literal rebuilding of that country by Americans. There's still a lot of goodwill that was built up in the 1950s and 1960s toward the U.S. and some other countries where some of those, their relationships might have been more fraught at certain points. And that's certainly true in West Africa because of sort of the post-colonial context. That's one of the things that interested me to see in Ghana was that there is this sense in which Ghanaians are very proud of their independence. That we are not a British subject anymore. They have an enormous independent square. So one of the questions that I was asking was, how is it that the church enters into relationship in this particular place and time? And it's tricky there. Because on the one hand, I think the church has really tried to make adjustments around things like the temple. You put in a fancy temple, but you have to surround it with walls. It's for good reason. There's lots of crime. There's severe poverty, but the look of it is again kind of gives mixed messages. For some people, it's like, oh, I want to be part of that. Cinderella Castle Church in the middle of town. And for other people, it's a little suspect, I would say. There's like, why, what's going on behind those walls? So there's still lots of rumors in Ghana. I don't know, Peggy, if you heard any of this, but still lots of rumors that Mormons drink people's blood, which goes back to the 1970s, that, these rumors that get passed around because of the secrecy and the fact that they're behind these walls and there's something about the lack of access that makes people suspicious.
They're big, I mean, they're opulent by comparison, especially, and sometimes in places that's surrounded by extreme poverty. So you talk, yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. And one of the things that's interesting is that the ward buildings, several missionaries pointed this out to me numerous times, is that the ward buildings, they used to build more ward buildings, but they have been scaling back and starting to rent very unobtrusive buildings in neighborhoods because they don't want them to stick out. They were worried. I think there was, at least the way the missionaries presented it to me, it was out of concern that these would just be magnets for people who didn't like Mormons. But they all kept pointing out to me as we drive along the signs. There's always a little sign that said Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and had an arrow pointing down an alley or something. But they had these little signs in the marketplaces and, all around town. But again, the attempt was to be kind of to downplay it. Mm-hmm. I'd say.
So even the chapels, which are certainly exactly much so, yeah. But yeah, okay. Interesting. That's very interesting.
So talk about how the shift to the 2-hour Sunday meeting schedule has affected Latter-day Saints in Africa, in the places you visited.
Well, it's interesting. I was there right at the time when that shift was taking place. And from what I understand, it was causing lots of problems. And problems, I'm sure that leadership in Utah wouldn't have, there's no reason they would have anticipated them unless they had really been on the ground and talked to people there. But the 3-hour block had allowed for people who had to travel long distances and pay to travel long distances to get to a 3-hour meeting. And one of those hours was often taken up with language instruction. Even though English is the official language in Ghana, I was really struck by how few of the people, when I went to the local ward, the sacrament meeting, and then the Relief Society meeting, how few of those women spoke English. And in fact, the woman who was sort of directing the lesson for that week had to translate as she went along some of it. She was trying to do a section from the Book of Mormon, but it needed to be translated sort of simultaneously. So the English language lessons were extremely important, especially for women, I think, again, who don't have as much access to education often. And you can't, to scale that back to once a month as they had to start contemplating with the 2-hour block was just not sustainable. You can't learn a language when you're looking at it once a month. The other option was to do it like on a Wednesday night or another night of the week. But for a lot of those women, they couldn't get away from their jobs. They couldn't afford to travel to the chapel twice in 1 week. It was just too expensive. So it presented all these problems just with the lack of resources that these people have, there. I don't know what's happened since then. They were working it out. They were finding ways, I'm sure, to work it out. But it was just not obvious that was a good thing.
Interesting. Okay, so one last question. How do you think the church is balancing or has balanced accommodation to local needs like that with the such a church standardization? Like the church is the same everywhere you go. Do you see that balance shifting to more local and less centralization, or no?
Yeah, it's a little hard to tell. I think in some ways it has. There are some local accommodations that have been made. It's easier to make. I guess it's easier to standardize in places where there's a shorter history for the church. And in some ways in West Africa, it's almost easier than it is in a place like New Zealand, where the Maori Mormon tradition goes way back, and where there were many, many decades that Maori Mormons were allowed to worship in their own way. They were allowed to hold their own funeral services using traditional Maori customs. They were allowed to use scarification on their faces, the tattooing and such, because there wasn't anyone close enough to oversee it. And the missionaries, I think, were really told, just look the other way. And when that began to change after World War II, in particular, when the standardization and then correlation became sort of the key word, it's really caused a lot of pushback from people who said, we know how to be Mormon. Don't tell us what to do. West Africa, I think, is got a different situation again. There's just not a long history to it there. So they don't know anything but what they're seeing now. And we'll see how that plays out.
Fascinating, interesting to watch this play out. Laurie Maffly-Kipp, thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to Dave Noyes.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up. We'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.